Picture this. A combat aircraft takes off from its home base, not to dash toward a target, not to make a single decisive run, but to stay. It climbs, levels off, and settles into a pattern that looks almost uneventful. Hours pass, then more hours. It does not return. Instead, another aircraft meets it in mid-air. Fuel transfers. The first aircraft remains where it is. Nothing about the aircraft itself has changed. Same engines, same wings, same fuel tanks. Yet its relationship with distance, time and space is now completely different. This is where the usual idea of range begins to feel unstable. For a long time, range felt like a clean mechanical concept. How far an aircraft could go before it had to turn back. A number tied to fuel capacity, engine efficiency, and aerodynamic drag. Longer range meant more freedom, shorter range meant tighter limits. That intuition worked when aircraft operated in simple arcs: take off, fly out, strike, return. But look at how modern air operations actually behave. Aircraft do not just arrive anymore, they remain. They loiter, they orbit, they wait. They hold positions that matter, even when nothing appears to be happening. And once that becomes the dominant behavior, the meaning of range quietly shifts. Consider what distance used to represent. Distance was friction. Every additional mile reduced options. It consumed fuel, it compressed timelines, it forced decisions. If you could not physically reach a place, it did not factor into planning. So range became a proxy for capability. More range meant access, less range meant exclusion, but mid-air refueling changes none of the aircraft's internal characteristics, and yet it dissolves that friction almost entirely. The aircraft does not need to be closer, it does not need a bigger fuel tank, it does not need to land. Distance stops behaving like a hard boundary. At this point, it's tempting to say, refueling just extends range. But that phrasing already assumes the old framework still applies. What actually changes is not how far the aircraft can go, it is how long it can stay relevant once it arrives. The aircraft is no longer governed by a single outbound leg and a single return leg. It is governed by a rhythm: refuel, remain, refuel, again, remain longer. The operational shape stops being a line and starts becoming a loop. And loops behave very differently from lines. Once aircraft operate in loops, the planning question is no longer, can this platform reach that distance? The question quietly becomes, can the system sustain presence there? Those are not the same problem. The first belongs to engineering performance. The second belongs to coordination, positioning, and endurance. And endurance is not something the aircraft carries inside itself. Watch how air campaigns are actually paced. Early phases look busy, sorties launch, aircraft surge forward, movement is visible, then things slow down, aircraft begin to cycle through the same airspace repeatedly, sensors remain active, communications stay open, threats are monitored continuously. From the outside it looks static, but that stillness is the point. Presence becomes more valuable than motion. In that environment, the aircraft with the longest range is not necessarily the most useful one. The useful one is the one that does not need to leave. Mid-air refueling makes that possible by separating endurance from the aircraft itself. Fuel becomes a transferable resource. Time becomes modular. Presence becomes schedulable. Instead of asking how far a single aircraft can fly, planners ask how many aircraft can be kept there continuously without interruption. Range fades into the background. Persistence moves to the foreground. And persistence is not a performance number. Notice what disappears from the conversation once refueling is assumed. No one asks whether the aircraft can make it back. No one treats fuel exhaustion as a dramatic endpoint. Instead, refueling becomes a quiet expectation, like bandwidth in a network. When it works, no one notices it. When it fails, everything collapses. That alone should signal that something fundamental has shifted. Think about how this reframes distance. Distance no longer separates reachable from unreachable. It separates easy to sustain from hard to sustain. Two locations can be equally far away, yet one is operationally trivial and the other is exhausting, not because of the aircraft, because of the refueling geometry required to keep aircraft there. Distance stops being linear, it becomes relational. This is why talking about aircraft range in isolation starts to feel misleading. An aircraft with modest internal range, embedded in a dense refueling network, can exert influence far beyond what its specifications suggest. Another aircraft with impressive advertised range but weak access to refueling support may be operationally brittle. On paper, the second looks superior. In practice, the first is easier to keep alive, relevant, and persistent. The old intuition struggles to account for that. And once persistence becomes the goal, something else happens. Time stretches. Operations are no longer defined by the moment of arrival. They are defined by how long presence can be maintained without gaps. A gap of minutes matters. A gap of hours can unravel an entire posture. Suddenly, the system that keeps aircraft fueled becomes more critical than the aircraft that burns the fuel. Not because it flies, but because it allows everything else to keep flying. At this point, range starts to behave like an outdated measurement. It still exists, it still matters in edge cases, but it no longer explains why certain air operations feel effortless while others feel strained, even with similar aircraft involved. The difference is not how far the aircraft can go, it is how forgiving the system is when time passes. This is also why modern air operations feel less dramatic than before. There is less emphasis on singular, high-risk penetrations, more emphasis on continuous coverage, less focus on speed, more focus on staying power, less obsession with distance crossed, more concern about hours sustained. Those shifts don't show up in performance charts, but they dominate real planning conversations. Mid-air refueling doesn't add a little capability to aircraft. It quietly changes what capability means. It turns fuel from a limiting factor into a scheduling problem. It turns distance from a wall into a gradient. It turns range from a headline number into background noise. And once you notice that, it becomes hard to look at range the same way again. Once refueling is assumed, planners stop treating fuel as something an aircraft runs out of. They treat it as something the system moves around. That distinction sounds subtle. In practice, it changes everything. An aircraft no longer carries all of its future options inside itself. Those options arrive later, in pieces, from somewhere else, which means the aircraft's usefulness is no longer front-loaded, it unfolds over time. This is where the old range-based intuition quietly breaks down. Range implies a fixed envelope. You draw a circle on a map. Inside the circle, possible. Outside the circle, impossible. Refueling dissolves that circle, not by making it larger, but by making it irrelevant. What matters now is not the maximum distance from takeoff, but the continuity of support along the way and after arrival. The aircraft doesn't need to reach the mission area once, it needs to be kept there repeatedly. Look at how planning language shifts when this becomes normal. Instead of asking how far the aircraft can fly, discussions revolve around coverage windows. Instead of counting miles, they count hours on station. Instead of worrying about the outbound leg, they worry about turnover timing, who leaves, who arrives, and whether the handoff is clean. These are not performance questions, they are coordination questions, and coordination scales very differently from performance. Performance improvements tend to stack slowly and expensively. A little more range requires a lot more effort. Coordination improvements, by contrast, can multiply effects. One additional refueling orbit can stabilize an entire region. One adjustment in timing can eliminate repeated transits. One persistent presence can remove the need for constant movement. None of that shows up in an aircraft's specifications, yet it dominates outcomes. This is why range starts to feel like the wrong abstraction. It describes a capability that matters most when operations are discrete and finite. Modern air operations are neither. They are continuous, they are overlapping, they are designed to avoid clean endpoints. Refueling enables that continuity not by extending reach, but by smoothing time, and time, once smoothed, behaves differently than distance. Distance is unforgiving. Once crossed, it offers no flexibility. Time is adjustable, it can be stretched, compressed, redistributed. Mid-air refueling turns fuel into a time management tool. The aircraft no longer asks, "How far can I go before I must stop?" It effectively asks, "How long can the system afford to keep me here?" That question cannot be answered by looking at the aircraft alone. At this point, another illusion begins to surface. If range is no longer the binding constraint, then improving range is no longer the dominant path to advantage. An aircraft with extraordinary internal range but poor integration into a refueling system will still behave as a temporary visitor. Meanwhile, an aircraft with ordinary range but seamless access to refueling behaves like a resident. Presence stops being tied to physical endurance, it becomes organizational endurance. This also explains why certain air operations feel effortless from the outside. Aircraft appear where expected, they remain for as long as needed, they depart without urgency. There is no visible rush, no dramatic fuel countdown. That calm is not the result of better aircraft performance. It is the result of the system absorbing stress before it reaches the aircraft. Range did not disappear, it was absorbed. And once absorbed, it no longer deserves to be treated as a headline metric. It still constrains edge cases. It still matters when systems are sparse or disrupted, but in the normal case, the case modern air power is built around, range is no longer what separates possible from impossible. It separates systems that feel tight from systems that feel relaxed. That distinction is subtle, but it is decisive. This is why talking about long-range aircraft often leads to confusion. What actually matters is not how far the aircraft can fly unaided, but how forgiving the surrounding system is when plans change. Can aircraft stay longer than expected? Can replacements arrive without gaps? Can presence be sustained without burning attention? Those questions have answers that lie outside the aircraft. At some point, it becomes clear that range is describing the wrong thing. It describes a property of isolation. Modern operations are defined by connection. Once aircraft stop operating as isolated units, their range stops being a reliable proxy for their usefulness. The aircraft hasn't changed. The environment around it has, and the old intuition that endurance must be carried on board no longer survives contact with that environment. That is the uncomfortable realization. When refueling is assumed, range doesn't vanish, it just stops explaining outcomes. Once you start looking for it, the shift becomes hard to ignore. Air operations no longer feel organized around departure points, they feel organized around occupied time. Aircraft are launched not to complete a journey, but to maintain a condition. That condition is presence, and presence does not behave like range. Range is something you expend, presence is something you manage. When presence becomes the goal, the system's priorities quietly reorder themselves. The aircraft is no longer the center of gravity. The flow that sustains it is. Fuel moves, aircraft rotate, coverage persists. Nothing dramatic happens at any single moment, but removing any one link causes the whole pattern to collapse. This is why refueling rarely looks impressive until it isn't there. Notice how failure is now perceived. When an aircraft with a limited range turns back early, that feels expected. When a persistent presence suddenly disappears, that feels like a system failure. The difference is not emotional, it's structural. One failure belongs to the platform, the other belongs to the network. And networks, once relied upon, are judged by continuity, not peaks. This is also why debates about who has longer range increasingly miss the point. Two forces can operate similar aircraft at similar distances, yet experience completely different levels of strain. One feels like it is constantly racing fuel limits, the other feels like it is settling into a routine. The difference is not range, it is how many small interruptions the system can absorb without anyone noticing. That quality does not show up on a datasheet. At this stage, the word range starts to do more harm than good. It pulls attention back toward the aircraft, toward internal limits, toward isolated performance, but modern air power is no longer organized that way. It is organized around persistence without drama, around presence that does not need to announce itself, around systems that make distance feel boring. When distance becomes boring, it stops being decisive. What becomes decisive instead is whether presence can be maintained quietly, day after day, without demanding constant adjustment or visible effort. That is not something an aircraft can guarantee on its own. It is something only a system can provide. This is the point where the old intuition finally runs out of traction. If you keep thinking of range as how far an aircraft can fly, you will keep asking the wrong questions. You will keep looking for answers in airframes and engines when the real constraints have already moved elsewhere, not upward in performance, but outward into coordination. And that is where this story deliberately stops. Not with a new definition, not with a named rule, just with the uncomfortable sense that a familiar metric, one that used to explain so much, no longer explains very much at all.